Hi there. If you're here, chances are you're after two things: a little history and a lot of rest. So go ahead, settle in, find that perfect position you pretend doesn't take 7 tries. Maybe lower the lights. Maybe pull your blanket up like it's shielding you from the cruel realities of the 21st century. Tonight, we're going back to Victorian London. Yes, that London. Fog, gas lamps, top hats, and the occasional corpse in a back alley. But don't worry, nothing too gruesome. We're not here for the jump scares. We're here to slowly, gently realize that if you were dropped into 1888 Whitechapel, you'd probably tap out before lunch. Between the smells, the smog, and the sheer number of people coughing directly into your face, surviving a day would be ambitious. You've heard the name Jack the Ripper. Maybe you've watched a documentary. Maybe you've even said he was never caught in a trivia night once like a tiny spooky flex. But tonight we're not chasing Jack. We're becoming him, sort of. Not the murder part, let's be clear. We're not that kind of podcast. We're talking about the life he led when he wasn't, how he lived, what he saw, what he smelled. You won't like what he smelled. So close your eyes, breathe slow, forget your emails, forget your laundry, and get ready to time travel into a dirty, damp, deeply chaotic slice of history. Because tonight, you are Jack the Ripper. And sorry to say, you're really bad at it. Expectations versus reality. Victorian London. Land of elegance, mystery, and charmingly bad dental hygiene. You've seen it in films. Cobblestone streets, flickering gas lamps, fog that rolls in like it's paid to be dramatic. Gentlemen in top hats, ladies in corsets, horse-drawn carriages clattering past while someone quotes Shakespeare in the background for no reason at all. It all feels oddly cozy, doesn't it? But let's put that fantasy down gently. Maybe wrap it in a doily and tuck it away. Because the real 1888 wasn't so much Sherlock Holmes as it was, please don't step in that. Let's start with the smell. London was overflowing with people, horses, and all the things that come out of both. Sewers were overwhelmed. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. And if you were lucky, the wind blew the stench away from you. If you were unlucky, the wind was the stench. Imagine walking home after a long day of whatever people did before phones existed. You're tired. Your feet hurt because shoes weren't exactly a perfected science in 1888. The left one always feels like it was made for someone else's foot, possibly someone with fewer toes. And then it hits you. That wall of odor that makes your eyes water. Is it the open sewer? The tannery? The fish market where yesterday's unsold catch is slowly becoming tomorrow's health crisis? It's all of the above, my friend. And more. Much more. The Thames, that majestic river flowing through London's heart, wasn't so much a waterway as it was a liquid garbage disposal. By 1858, the situation had become so dire that Parliament had to be suspended due to what historians delicately call the Great Stink. Yes, the smell was so bad that the government literally couldn't function. If only they knew what future political excuses would look like. By 1888, things had improved somewhat, thanks to engineer Joseph Bazalgette's remarkable sewer system. But somewhat is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, like saying a hurricane is somewhat wetter than a drizzle. Now, picture Whitechapel, a cramped, working-class district in the East End. Thousands of people packed into crumbling tenements, whole families in a single room. No insulation, no privacy, no peace and quiet, unless you count unconsciousness. The poverty was staggering. Not the, I can't afford the latest iPhone kind of poverty. More the, I haven't eaten in 3 days and my children are sharing one pair of shoes between them variety. Reports from social reformers of the time describe families of 7 or 8 living in spaces smaller than modern bathrooms. The walls were often damp. The windows, if they existed, rarely kept out the cold. And privacy was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. You think your upstairs neighbor is loud? Try sharing a paper-thin wall with a butcher, his 5 children, 2 chickens, and one man who coughs like he's auditioning to be tuberculosis. Speaking of tuberculosis, let's talk about health for a moment. We're in an era where medical knowledge was advancing, but not quite fast enough to help most people, especially those in places like Whitechapel. Doctors existed, sure, but unless you had money, your healthcare plan was essentially try not to die with the side of good luck with that. Common treatments included bloodletting, because apparently having less blood was thought to help somehow, doses of mercury, which is in fact poison, and various concoctions that were essentially alcohol with some herbs thrown in. A headache could be treated with cocaine. Feeling tired? Try some opium. Child won't stop crying. Morphine syrup should do the trick. It's no wonder the Victorians had such a fascination with death. They saw plenty of it. And yet, people romanticize this era. Victorian times were so much simpler, they say. Sure. If by simpler you mean everyone's teeth hurt and antibiotics hadn't been invented yet, the Victorians did give us some nice things, I'll grant you that. They had a certain aesthetic flair, if you could afford it. Those fancy dresses you see in period dramas? Beautiful, yes. Practical? About as practical as swimming in a ball gown. Women's fashion was particularly challenging, with corsets that could rearrange your internal organs and crinolines so wide you had to turn sideways to fit through doorways. Men didn't have it much better with their stiff collars and multiple layers even in summer, but at least they could vote and own property and exist in public without being judged for having ankles. Here's the reality. Life expectancy in Whitechapel, mid-30s, and that was an average, boosted by the lucky few who lived to see their own wrinkles. If you were born in Whitechapel in the 1850s, making it to your 5th birthday was an achievement worth celebrating. If your family could afford a celebration, which they probably couldn't, infant mortality was shockingly high. 1 in 5 children died before reaching their 1st birthday. Those who survived faced risks of scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, and a host of other diseases we now prevent with vaccines and treat with antibiotics. But wait, there's more. Food was scarce. Work was brutal. And medical care? Imagine a man with a thick mustache handing you whiskey and a saw and saying, "Hold still." Let's talk about food for a minute. Modern grocery stores are remarkable treasures we take for granted. In Victorian Whitechapel, your food shopping experience was slightly different. Markets sold goods of questionable freshness. Meat could be discolored, reeking, or even crawling with visible evidence of decomposition. But when you're hungry enough, you develop a surprisingly flexible definition of edible. Bread, a staple for the poor, was often adulterated with chalk, sawdust, or alum to make it whiter and stretch supplies further. Milk might be watered down or, for the extra entrepreneurial milk seller, enhanced with formaldehyde to extend its shelf life. Nothing says nutritious breakfast quite like embalming fluid in your tea. Speaking of tea, that was one small comfort available to most, though the quality varied wildly depending on what you could afford. For many in Whitechapel, the evening meal might consist of nothing more than a cup of tea and a slice of bread. If you were lucky, perhaps a bit of dripping, congealed fat to spread on it. And work? Oh, the joys of Victorian labor. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, which meant jobs were often dangerous, dehumanizing, and paid barely enough to avoid starvation. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in factories, mines, or as chimney sweeps, their small bodies perfect for squeezing into tight, soot-filled spaces. Nothing says childhood memories like respiratory disease and stunted growth. For women in Whitechapel, options were particularly limited. Domestic service if you were lucky, factory work if you were less so. And for the desperately poor, prostitution became a grim economic necessity. In 1888 Whitechapel, an estimated 1,200 women worked as prostitutes, not from moral failing or personal choice, but from the simple, brutal math of survival. The workday started before dawn and often continued until after dark. 6 days a week was standard, with Sunday reserved for church. Because after 80 hours of labor, What you really need is someone telling you that your suffering is part of God's plan. For those too ill, too old, or too unfortunate to work, there was the workhouse, an institution designed to be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek its shelter. Families were separated, food was minimal, and the daily routine was designed to break both body and spirit. Poor relief was less about relief and more about punishing the crime of being poor. Transportation wasn't much better. Unless you were wealthy enough to afford a private carriage, you walked everywhere, in all weather, through streets that were, as I mentioned earlier, effectively open sewers. The more fortunate might ride in omnibuses, horse-drawn public transportation that was crowded, uncomfortable, and entirely at the mercy of London traffic, which could make modern rush hour look positively speedy. And the horses! Let's not forget about them. London had thousands, each producing around 20-30 pounds of manure daily. That's tons of horse droppings on the streets every single day. When it rained, the streets became rivers of, well, I'll let your imagination fill in that particular blank. When it was dry and windy, the pulverized dried manure became dust that coated everything and everyone. Delightful either way, really. Lighting and heating were luxuries, not givens. Gaslighting existed but was expensive. Most poor homes relied on candles or oil lamps, which were not only inadequate, but fire hazards in those tightly packed wooden buildings. Heat came from coal or wood fires when they could be afforded, which filled homes with smoke and soot. In winter, it wasn't uncommon for people to simply stay in bed as much as possible, huddling together for warmth. Water came from communal pumps or wells, often contaminated with sewage. The connection between dirty water and disease was beginning to be understood thanks to pioneers like John Snow, who linked a cholera outbreak to a specific water pump in 1854. But clean water remained a luxury rather than a right. Even something as simple as bathing was a complex logistical challenge. Imagine hauling buckets of water from a street pump, heating them over a fire if you could afford the fuel, then somehow fitting your adult body into a small tub in a room shared with your entire family. Now, imagine doing this in a London winter, in a building with no insulation, where the water starts to cool the moment it's removed from the fire. Is it any wonder that many people simply didn't? The Victorian nose was, by necessity, more tolerant than our modern one. Let's not even start on dental care. Actually, no, let's go there briefly because it's a special kind of horror. Toothbrushes existed, but weren't widespread among the poor. Toothpaste as we know it didn't exist. People used everything from chalk to salt to crushed charcoal to clean their teeth when they bothered at all. Dentistry was primarily concerned with extraction rather than preservation. Anesthesia was in its infancy. The result? By age 40, most people were missing at least some teeth, and many had none at all. So before we dive into what it would feel like to be Jack the Ripper, let's be honest. Even just being alive in his neighborhood was already a challenge. Even sleep, that most basic of human needs, was compromised. Beds, if you had them, were often shared with multiple family members and a generous population of bedbugs, lice, and fleas. The night was rarely quiet, with thin walls doing little to block the sounds of arguments, crying babies, drunken singing, or the moans of the ill. Speaking of the night, darkness in Victorian Whitechapel was different from what we experience today. Without light pollution, when the sun went down, darkness was nearly complete except for the occasional gas lamp. It's difficult for our modern minds to comprehend just how dark a city could be. This darkness wasn't romantic, it was dangerous, hiding open cellar doors, uneven pavements, uncovered holes, and of course, less savory human elements waiting to separate you from your possessions, or worse. Crime was rampant, and not just the sensational murders that captured headlines. Pickpocketing was an art form, practiced by children trained from early ages by adult Fagins, named after the character in Dickens's Oliver Twist, which was less fiction and more lightly disguised reportage. robbery, assault, domestic violence. All were daily occurrences, handled by a police force that was still relatively new and overwhelmed. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, was understaffed and under-equipped. Officers didn't carry firearms, relying instead on wooden truncheons and, occasionally, their whistles to summon help. They patrolled predictable beats, often allowing criminals to simply wait until they'd passed before resuming their activities. Detection methods were primitive. Fingerprinting wasn't adopted until 1901, and forensic science as we know it barely existed. Justice was swift but not necessarily fair. If caught, offenders faced a legal system that presumed guilt rather than innocence and provided little in the way of defense for those who couldn't afford it. Punishments ranged from fines, impossible for most to pay, to imprisonment in conditions that made Whitechapel's slums look positively inviting, to transportation to colonies, to hanging for more serious crimes. Entertainment, that small respite from daily hardship, was similarly class-divided. The wealthy had their theaters, concerts, and social gatherings. For the poor, there were music halls if you could afford the penny or two for admission, or more commonly, pubs. Alcohol was often safer to drink than water and provided temporary escape from the grinding realities of daily life. For many in Whitechapel, the pub was living room, social club, and sanctuary rolled into one. It was where news was shared, jobs were found, and for a brief moment, the cold and darkness of London's East End could be held at bay. Of course, this escape came with its own price. Alcoholism was rampant, further straining already precarious family economies and contributing to violence and abuse. Religion offered another form of escape, though an increasingly dubious one for many. The Church of England remained powerful, but was losing its grip on the working classes. Various evangelical movements made inroads, offering not just spiritual salvation, but sometimes practical help in the form of soup kitchens, clothing drives, and educational opportunities. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865, was particularly active in areas like Whitechapel, though their strict temperance stance was not always welcomed by those who saw drink as their only available comfort. Class divisions were stark and visible. The West End of London, with its elegant squares and fashionable shops, might as well have been a different planet from the East End slums, though they were separated by just a few miles. The wealthy occasionally ventured east for slumming expeditions, poverty tourism that let them feel simultaneously horrified and self-congratulatory before returning to their comfortable homes. The very language of the East End marked its residents as different. Cockney rhyming slang, that peculiar linguistic code, wasn't just colorful local dialect. It was a way for the lower classes to communicate without being understood by outsiders, particularly the police. It was language as resistance, as identity, as survival. Education, the great equalizer in modern society, was in its infancy as a universal right. The Education Act of 1870 had established board schools, but attendance wasn't compulsory until 1880, and even then, enforcement was spotty. Many families in Whitechapel needed their children's income more than they needed them to be literate. Books were luxury items. Newspapers were shared and read aloud for those who couldn't read themselves. This was the world of 1888 Whitechapel, not the sepia-tinted nostalgic version we see in Christmas cards or period dramas, not the romantic fog-shrouded mystery of Sherlock Holmes, but a harsh, grinding existence where survival itself was a daily achievement. And yet, humans being the remarkably adaptable creatures we are, people found ways to live, to love, to laugh, to create communities amid the squalor. They decorated their tiny rooms with whatever scraps of beauty they could afford. Perhaps a cheap print, a colorful cloth, a plant struggling toward what little sunlight reached through grimy windows. They sang, they told stories, they celebrated births and mourned deaths. They were, in short, people, not so different from us in their hopes and fears, however different their circumstances. But don't worry, things get worse. Because into this already challenging world, something else was about to emerge. Something that would turn the ordinary miseries of Whitechapel life into extraordinary terror. Something, or someone, who would transform this overlooked corner of London into a name recognized worldwide, a byword for mystery and horror. Jack was coming. A day in the life. You wake up as Jack the Ripper. You wake up. It's still dark, but the dark feels heavier here, thicker, like the air forgot how to move. You don't remember falling asleep. Actually, you don't remember much at all. Your head aches. Your hands are cold, and your fingers are dirty, not like missed a spot while gardening dirty, more like dug through something no one should dig through dirty. You sit up slowly. Everything creaks, including you. The room around you is barely lit by a cracked oil lamp. There's a chair, a coat, a cracked mirror, and your face in it. You look tired. Not the I binged a show till 3 a.m. tired. The I've seen things and none of them were pretty tired. You're in Whitechapel. You know that somehow the way you know how to breathe. The room smells like coal smoke, cheap gin, and something else. Something metallic. You pull on your coat. It's worn heavy, smells like the Thames at low tide. In the pocket, a few coins, a handkerchief, and nope, not checking the other pocket. Not yet. You stand. Your boots thud against the wooden floor. Thick-soled, scuffed, but quiet. You know how to move in them. And that's the first truly unsettling thing. Outside London groans awake. Fog coils in the alleys like it's looking for something. A drunk stumbles past your window, singing something that might have been a sea shanty once. The city feels alive, but not in a friendly way. You're hungry, but not for food. Not exactly. Something twists in your stomach. Not pain, not nausea, more like anticipation. And that scares you. You step out into the narrow street. The fog swallows you instantly, like the city wants to keep you secret. No one knows who you are, and somehow everyone seems to know you don't belong. You walk, instinctively, down familiar roads you don't remember learning. Your feet know the way, even if your brain doesn't. A constable walks past you and doesn't even glance. You blend in, too well, a shadow among shadows. You wonder, who were you before this? Were you someone kind? Someone scared? Someone who could sleep without hearing whispers? Your name is Jack now, even if you didn't choose it. Evening comes to Whitechapel. As the sky fades into a sickly gray, the streets start to shift. The day people disappear indoors. The night people come out. Some of them wear lipstick. Some of them carry knives. A few do both. Gas lamps flicker to life. Dim halos of light that do more to cast shadows than chase them away. The fog thickens, mixing with chimney smoke and breath and secrets. Your coat clings tighter to you, like it knows what's coming. You haven't eaten. You're not sure you want to. You stop by a tavern, not to drink but to listen. The regulars mutter about murders again. They don't know it's you. They guess it's a butcher, or a foreigner, or the devil himself. You sip watery gin and nod slowly. No one asks your name. Later you walk the alleys, slowly, calmly. People step aside, not out of fear, just instinct. You don't look dangerous. You look like you belong here, and that's worse somehow. A woman calls out to you. You shake your head. Keep walking. You're not here for that. At least, not tonight. You pause beneath a broken sign. You recognize this place, but not from memory, from feeling. Like déjà vu soaked in guilt. The fog curls around your boots. The silence is louder than before, and in the distance bells chime midnight. 12 dull, deliberate reminders that this day is ending. You return to your room. You take off your coat. You empty your pockets. You do not look at what's in the bottom of the drawer. You lie down. You close your eyes, and you wonder, when did you stop being afraid of the dark? You sleep, but it's not peaceful. Because tomorrow you wake up again, still Jack, still hunted, still something not quite human anymore. The following morning, your eyes open before dawn. Not because you're a morning person, because sleep has become your enemy. In your dreams, you remember too much. The ceiling above you has water stains that look like continents on a map of a world you don't want to visit. The wooden beams sag in the middle, bearing the weight of decades, perhaps a century of poverty and neglect. Just like everything else in Whitechapel, it endures because it has no choice. You don't bolt upright this time. You let your consciousness settle slowly into this body that feels both foreign and familiar. The mattress beneath you is lumpy, stuffed with straw that crackles with every movement. The sheets are rough cotton, not really clean, but not filthy either. Jack keeps his personal space orderly. That's one thing you've learned. Outside, a cart rumbles past. A dog barks. A baby cries. The sound quickly muffled by what you imagine is an exhausted mother's attempt to quiet it before the landlord complains. Morning in London begins early for those who have no choice in the matter. You swing your legs over the side of the bed. Your feet touch the cold wooden floor, and you notice the boards have been swept. Another detail about Jack: he's methodical, careful. The newspapers call him a monster, but monsters are chaotic. This is something worse. This is calculated. The small room you occupy is sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, a wooden chair with a shirt draped over it, clean, patched at the elbows, a washstand with a chipped ceramic basin and pitcher, a trunk at the foot of the bed, locked with a key you found under the mattress on your first night here. You haven't opened it yet. Part of you is afraid of what you'll find. Most of you is certain you already know. You pour water from the pitcher into the basin. It's cold, of course. Heating water is a luxury that requires time and coal, both of which are in short supply. You splash your face, then stare at your reflection in the small spotted mirror hanging on the wall. The face looking back at you seems ordinary. That's the most disturbing part. No glowing red eyes, no obvious madness, just a man in his 30s or 40s perhaps. It's hard to tell in this light with the shadows under your eyes and the pallor of your skin. Your hair is dark, neatly trimmed. Your beard is short, well kept. You look like you could be a clerk or a school teacher or a physician. The thought catches in your mind. Physician. Your hands move without your conscious direction, turning themselves palms up for inspection. They're clean now. You must have washed them thoroughly last night. But there's a faint stain under one fingernail that makes your stomach tighten. The hands themselves are not laborers' hands. They're dexterous, precise. The hands of someone who works with tools that require finesse. You find yourself wondering if Jack is a doctor. It would make sense, given what the newspapers hint at. The precision, the knowledge of anatomy. But no, a doctor would have better lodgings than this. Unless he's fallen on hard times, or unless this isn't his true home, just a place to become someone else. A knock at the door startles you. 3 sharp raps, then silence. You hesitate. Who would be calling on Jack? Does he have friends? Accomplices? The police? Moving cautiously, you approach the door. Who is it? Your voice sounds strange to your ears, deeper than expected, with an accent you can't quite place. Not quite London, but not clearly from elsewhere either. Rent, mister. Howard. Tuesday, remember? A woman's voice, impatient but not suspicious. Howard. So that's the name Jack uses here. You reach for your coat, find a few coins in the pocket. When you open the door, there's a stout woman in her 50s, hair pulled back in a tight bun, expression fixed in the permanent distrust of someone who makes her living collecting money from people who rarely have enough of it.
Mrs.
Grady, you hear yourself saying, though you have no memory of learning her name. Of course. Tuesday. You hand over the coins, which she counts twice before nodding curtly. Breakfast downstairs if you want it. Porridge. She looks at you with a mixture of disinterest and mild dislike. Not fear. She doesn't know what lives behind your eyes. You've been keeping late hours again, mister. Howard. It's not quite a question, but it demands a response. You find yourself smiling slightly, a practiced expression that doesn't reach your eyes. My work often requires it, Mrs. Grady. I apologize if I've disturbed you. Just don't bring no women up here. Respectable house this is. She turns and walks away, her footsteps heavy on the creaking stairs. You close the door, leaning against it. What work does Jack claim to do? What story has he told to explain his comings and goings at odd hours? Your stomach growls, reminding you that whatever else Jack might be, he still inhabits a human body with human needs. You finish dressing, putting on the clean shirt, a threadbare vest, and the coat that feels like armor when you slip it on. Before you leave the room, you check the pockets again, thoroughly this time. A handkerchief, plain but clean, a few more coins. A small notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting that matches the precision of your hands. You flip through it, addresses, times, observations of people and places. Nothing incriminating on the surface, but you understand its purpose immediately. Jack is watching, planning. You close the notebook and return it to your pocket. There's a folding knife as well, the kind a workman might carry. You test the blade with your thumb and find it sharp, well maintained. Again, not unusual for a working man in London, but in Jack's possession it takes on new significance. You fold it closed and put it back, feeling its weight like a stone. When you open the drawer of the small table beside the bed, you find what you've been avoiding, a leather case rolled and tied with a cord. Your hands move independently of your will, untying the cord, unrolling the case to reveal a set of surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, a bone saw, all immaculately clean, polished to a shine that catches the weak morning light filtering through the grimy window. You roll the case up quickly, your heart pounding. Doctor then, or surgeon, or someone with access to such tools and the knowledge to use them. You return the case to the drawer and shut it firmly, as if that could contain what it represents. The boarding house's common room is sparsely populated when you descend the narrow staircase. A thin man with a hacking cough huddled near the small fire. An elderly woman darning socks in the corner, her fingers moving with mechanical precision despite her rheumy eyes. A young man, barely more than a boy really, wolfing down porridge as if it might be his only meal of the day. None of them look up as you enter. In Whitechapel, minding your own business isn't just a courtesy, it's survival. Mrs. Grady appears from what must be the kitchen, carrying a bowl of gray porridge that she places on an empty table without a word. You sit and begin to eat. The porridge is bland, under-seasoned but hot and filling. As you eat, you listen to the conversations around you, gathering information. The young man is speaking to Mrs. Grady now, asking if she has any work for him. Strong back, ma'am. Can carry just about anything. Worked the docks last week, but it's slow now. Nothing here, she replies, not unkindly. Try the market. Sometimes they need help with the deliveries in the morning. The elderly woman mutters to herself as she sews, a running commentary on neighbors and events that no one seems to be listening to. And then she has the nerve to say my Johnny took it, when everyone knows her boy's the thief, takes after his father that way. God rest his wicked soul. The thin man coughs again, a wet, rattling sound that makes you wince. Consumption, most likely. You wonder how many others in this house are infected. How many have breathed the same air, drunk from the same cups. You finish your porridge and stand. No one notices. You're a ghost here, passing through their lives without leaving an impression. Or perhaps it's just that in Whitechapel, one learns not to notice too much, not to remember faces too clearly. Witnesses have a way of finding trouble. Outside, the morning is gray and damp, the kind of chill that seeps through clothing and settles in the bones. The street is already busy. Workers heading to factories or markets, peddlers with carts full of questionable goods, children running errands or simply running wild. London never truly sleeps. It just shifts from one kind of desperation to another. You begin walking, hands in your pockets, head slightly down. Not suspicious, just a man with somewhere to be. No different from 100 others on this street. Your feet seem to know where they're going, following a path that feels routine, though you have no memory of establishing it. The buildings around you are a hodgepodge of architectural styles, most in various states of disrepair. Once grand townhouses, now divided into dozens of cramped apartments. Newer tenements built cheaply and already crumbling. Shops with goods in the windows that never seem to change. Pubs with doors that will open soon for those whose thirst can't wait for evening. You pass a constable on his beat, touching the brim of your hat in a gesture of respect that makes him nod in return. He doesn't look at you twice. You're unremarkable, forgettable, perfect. Your route takes you past a newsstand where a boy is shouting the headlines. Another letter. Ripper taunts police. Read all about it. You slow your pace, dropping a coin into the boy's outstretched hand and taking a paper. The headline screams across the top, "Dear boss, new letter from Whitechapel fiend." You fold the paper and continue walking, feeling oddly disconnected from the words. Letters. Has Jack been writing to the police? To newspapers? You remember the neat handwriting in the notebook and wonder if it matches what's described in the article. You'll read it later, somewhere private. For now, you need to understand what Jack does during his days, where he goes, who he speaks to, how he hides in plain sight. Your path takes you to Commercial Street, one of the main thoroughfares of Whitechapel. It's lined with shops and stalls, crowded with people of all descriptions. The air smells of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, cooking food, and the ever-present undertone of the Thames. A complex perfume that is uniquely London. You find yourself stopping at a small tobacconist's shop. The bell over the door jingles as you enter, and the man behind the counter looks up with the automatic smile of a shopkeeper. Then his expression changes, warming with recognition. "Mr. Howard." "The usual, is it?" You nod, grateful that Jack seems to have established routines you can follow. "Please, Mr. Finch." The name comes to your lips unbidden. He turns to select a packet of tobacco from the shelf behind him. "Nasty business, these murders," he comments, shaking his head. "The missus doesn't want me letting her go out alone anymore, not even in daylight. Says a monster could be anybody." He gives a nervous laugh as he hands you the tobacco. "Not that I'm saying it could be you, of course, sir. Educated gentleman like yourself." You manage a tight smile as you pay him. "We all wear masks, Mr. Finch." The words slip out before you can consider them. "But I'm sure the police will catch him soon." "Hope so, sir. Hope so indeed." He doesn't seem to have found your comment strange, or if he did, the deference of a shopkeeper to a customer prevents him from showing it. Outside again, you continue your journey, stopping occasionally at shops where Jack is known. A bookstore where you browse but purchase nothing. A chemist where you buy a bottle of something labeled simply tonic. A small cafe where you have a cup of tea and a slice of bread with butter. In each place, you're greeted with varying degrees of familiarity, but no real warmth. Jack has acquaintances, not friends. By midday, you find yourself in a part of London that feels different, cleaner, more prosperous. The transition happened gradually, street by street, but now you're clearly out of Whitechapel. Here, the buildings are better maintained, the people better dressed. Your worn coat and scuffed boots mark you as an outsider, though no one challenges your presence. You stop before a building with a brass plate beside the door. London Hospital Medical College, a medical school. Something tugs at your memory. Or is it Jack's memory? Either way, the building feels significant. As you stand there, a man emerges. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect. He notices you, and his eyes narrow slightly. "Howard," he says, the word clipped short. "Didn't expect to see you here." You straighten your posture instinctively. Dr. Phillips." Again, the name comes without conscious thought. "Just passing by." He studies you with clinical detachment. "Still pursuing your independent studies?" "When time permits," you reply cautiously, uncertain of the subtext. He doesn't seem satisfied with your answer, but doesn't press. "Well, do remember what I said about discretion. These are sensitive times." He nods curtly and continues on his way, not waiting for your response. You watch him go, mind racing. What connection does Jack have to this man, to this place? The independent studies he mentioned send a chill through you. What exactly is Jack studying? And how? The remainder of the day passes in a blur of similar encounters. People who know Jack slightly, professionally but not intimately. No one who seems to care where he goes or what he does in his private hours. By the time evening approaches, you've pieced together a sketch of the man whose skin you're wearing. Jack Howard, though you suspect this isn't his real name, presents himself as a man of some education fallen on hard times. He has connections to the medical community, though whether as a doctor, surgeon, student, or something else remains unclear. He keeps to himself, maintains routines that make him unremarkable, and moves between Whitechapel and more respectable areas of London with the ease of someone who understands both worlds but belongs to neither. He is, in short, the perfect predator, capable of walking among his prey without raising alarm until it's too late. As dusk falls, you find yourself drawn back to Whitechapel, to the narrow streets and shadowed alleys where Jack's other life unfolds. The evening crowds are different from the morning ones. More men heading to pubs, more women with painted faces and weary eyes seeking customers, more desperation as another day of survival comes to an end without bringing anyone in Whitechapel closer to escape. You pass a group of women huddled together, sharing a bottle and conversation. They fall silent as you approach, watching you with practiced wariness. One of them, older than the rest, with a face that might once have been pretty before life carved its hardships into it, speaks up. "Evening, sir. Looking for company tonight?" You shake your head, not trusting your voice. These women, these are Jack's victims or women just like them, working the streets because hunger is a more immediate threat than any shadowy killer. You want to warn them. Run! Hide! Don't trust men who walk alone at night. But the words stick in your throat, because in this moment, you are the very danger you want to warn them against. The woman shrugs, already turning her attention elsewhere. Suit yourself. You continue walking, feeling the weight of what Jack has done, what he will do again, pressing down on you. The newspaper in your pocket seems to burn against your chest. You find a pub darker and less crowded than most and slip inside. The air is thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of beer and unwashed bodies. You order gin, take it to a corner table, and finally unfold the newspaper. The article about the letter is front-page news, though the letter itself isn't printed in full. Too vulgar for public consumption, apparently. But there are excerpts, and they turn your stomach. "Dear boss," it begins, mockingly familiar. The writer claims credit for the murders, promises more, taunts the police for their inability to catch him. "I am down on whores," one line reads, the casual hatred chilling in its directness. And the signature, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper," a theatrical flourish that suggests the writer is enjoying his infamy. Is this really from the killer? From Jack? Or a hoax by someone seeking attention? You can't be sure, but something about the gleeful malice in the words resonates with the darkness you feel lurking behind your borrowed consciousness. You finish your drink, pay, and step back into the night. The streets are quieter now, the respectable citizens of Whitechapel safely behind locked doors. Only those with nowhere else to go or nothing left to lose remain outside. The fog has returned, thicker than before, muffling sounds and turning gas lamps into distant, blurry stars. The hunger returns. That twisting, anticipatory feeling in your gut that isn't quite physical. Your feet begin to move with purpose, taking you deeper into the maze of alleys and courts where the poorest of Whitechapel's poor make their homes. Your hand slips into your pocket, fingers closing around the folding knife. No. You force yourself to stop, leaning against a wall, breathing heavily. This isn't you. You won't let it be you, no matter whose body you're inhabiting, whose memories are filtering through your mind. But the night is young, and it's so very dark, and Jack is patient. He can wait until your resistance weakens, until the boundary between his will and yours blurs enough for him to take control again. You push away from the wall and rush back toward the boarding house, not caring now if your haste looks suspicious. Better to lock yourself in that small room, to sleep if you can, to wait for dawn when the streets fill again with witnesses and the darkness retreats for a few precious hours. Mrs. Grady is still awake when you burst through the front door, sitting by the dying fire with her ledger open on her lap. She looks up, startled by your entrance. Mr. Howard? You look like you've seen a ghost. You manage to compose yourself, straightening your coat, forcing your breathing to slow. Just the fog makes shadows play tricks. She nods, though her eyes remain suspicious. There's worse than shadows out there these nights. Yes, you agree, heading for the stairs. Yes, there certainly is. In your room you remove your coat, but not your clothes lying fully dressed on the bed. Sleep seems impossible, but you must try. Must hope that when you wake, you'll be yourself again, far from this time and place and the horrors that Jack has planned for the coming night. But as your eyes close, fighting against your will to keep them open, you know the truth. Tomorrow you'll wake up again, still Jack, still hunted, still something not quite human anymore. And the streets of Whitechapel will be waiting, the darker side of the era. You thought the hard part was waking up as Jack, but London was already broken long before you arrived. You can feel it in the walls, in the air, in the way people look at the ground when they walk, as if afraid of eye contact, or afraid of being remembered. Whitechapel isn't just poor, it's crumbling. The city is splitting at the seams, overpopulated, underfed, and suffocating under its own smoke. The rich live in clean homes a few miles west. The poor, they rot in slums that leak, mold, and whisper at night. You pass a child, barefoot, filthy, maybe 5 years old. He looks at you with eyes that already gave up on childhood. He doesn't speak. He doesn't have to. The boy stands motionless in the shadow of a dilapidated tenement, one hand clutching a frayed rope that might once have been a toy. His clothes are patchworks of patches, layers of hand-me-downs from siblings who probably didn't survive long enough to wear them out properly. His hair, matted and unwashed, might be blonde under all that grime. Hard to tell. What strikes you most isn't his physical condition, though that's tragic enough. It's the emptiness behind his gaze. Children should be curious, should look at the world with wonder. This one looks at it with weary acceptance. He's an old soul trapped in a body that hasn't grown enough to work yet, but soon will be forced to. You find yourself reaching into your pocket, extracting a penny that you hold out without a word. The boy takes it with practiced efficiency, making it disappear so quickly you almost wonder if it was ever in your hand at all. He doesn't smile, doesn't thank you, just nods once, a businessman acknowledging the completion of a transaction, and slips away down an alley too narrow for an adult to follow. 1 penny. It might buy him a crust of bread or a moment's warmth by someone's fire. It won't change his fate. Won't keep consumption from finding his lungs or cholera from souring his belly. Won't give him an education or a future beyond becoming another shadow haunting these streets. You wonder if Jack gives pennies to children, if some small part of him recognizes their suffering as kindred to whatever warped his own soul. Or perhaps he sees them as merely unripe fruit, not yet ready for his particular brand of harvest. Death isn't rare here, it's routine. People don't ask if someone died, they ask how soon. The obituary columns in Whitechapel's local papers are longer than the advertisements, the births, and the marriages combined. Death is the neighborhood's most reliable industry, keeping gravediggers, coffin makers, and sellers of mourning clothes in steady business. You hear it discussed in casual conversation as you pass a group of women hauling laundry to a washhouse. Poor Mrs. Jenkins lost her youngest last night, says one, her tone sympathetic but unsurprised. Was it the croup? Asks another. No, the fever, same as took her middle boy last winter. Well, that's 3 of her 5 gone now. She'll be joining them soon enough herself, working at that textile mill. The dust gets 'em all in the end. They cross themselves half-heartedly and continue on their way. No wailing, no rending of garments, just the dull acknowledgement of another life cut short, another family diminished, another tiny tragedy in a place where tragedy has worn itself so common as to become merely routine. There's cholera, typhus, tuberculosis. Diseases roam freely like street dogs with good memory and bad manners. Hospitals are where you go to wait for someone to explain your funeral. The diseases love Whitechapel. How could they not? The conditions here are perfect for their propagation. Overcrowded housing, inadequate sanitation, polluted water, malnourished bodies. They pass from person to person with the casual intimacy of familial kisses, riding on shared cups, communal towels, the very air in rooms where too many bodies breathe too little oxygen. Cholera turns strong men into withered husks in hours, their bodies purging themselves from both ends until there's nothing left but skin stretched over bone. Typhus brings its signature rash and delirium, fever cooking brains until the victims babble secrets they'd kept for decades. Tuberculosis, the white plague, takes its time, allowing its host to linger for months or years, coughing blood into handkerchiefs they try to hide from worried relatives. Smallpox leaves its survivors marked for life, their faces cratered like the surface of the moon. Diphtheria chokes children slowly, building membranes in their throats until they suffocate. Scarlet fever burns through tenements, turning the residents red before it turns them cold. You pass London Hospital, where the truly desperate end up when home remedies and neighborhood wise women have failed them. It's an imposing building, meant to inspire confidence, but you know better. Inside those walls, the miasma theory of disease still holds sway among many practitioners. Germs are a new and controversial concept. Surgeons move from autopsy to operation without washing their hands, carrying death from the already deceased to the soon-to-be. Medicine is a coin toss. Leeches, amputations, laudanum if you're lucky, a misdiagnosis if you're not, which, to be fair, is most of the time. You spot a shop with darkened windows and a discreet sign, pharmaceutical chemist. Inside, you know, are rows of bottles containing tinctures, tonics, and treatments that range from useless to actively harmful. Mercury for syphilis, slowly poisoning patients as it battles the disease. Arsenic compounds for malaria and other fevers. Strychnine as a stimulant. Opium derivatives for everything from toothaches to troubled nerves to colicky infants. The local papers are filled with advertisements for patent medicines, each claiming to cure everything from consumption to cancer to feminine complaints. A doctor. William's pink pills for pale people. Lydia E. Pinkham's vegetable compound. Professor Holloway's pills. Each comes with testimonials from satisfied customers who probably never existed, or if they did, died shortly after providing their endorsement. Actual physicians are in short supply in Whitechapel. Those with medical degrees prefer to practice in wealthier neighborhoods, where patients can pay and conditions aren't quite so hopeless. Here, the sick make do with apothecaries of questionable training, midwives who double as abortionists when necessary, and barber surgeons whose approach to most ailments involves bloodletting, blistering, or both. Surgery remains a nightmare of pain and infection. Anesthesia exists but is unevenly applied, especially for the poor. Ether and chloroform have made operations less torturous, but many surgeons still pride themselves on speed over precision. The best can remove a limb in under 2 minutes, while assistants hold down the screaming patient. Post-operative infection kills as many as the conditions that made surgery necessary in the first place. You wonder how many of these medical professionals Jack has observed, learning from their casual cruelty. Perhaps he's even one of them himself. The thought makes you shudder. Then there's the workhouses. They call them relief, but they're really punishment. If you're desperate enough to enter, they shave your head, strip your name, and feed you less than a prison gives its rats. You're not poor, you're a burden, and society wants you to feel that. Whitechapel Workhouse stands like a fortress of misery, its brick walls stained with decades of London soot. It was built to warehouse poverty, to hide it away from the delicate sensibilities of the middle and upper classes. Inside, families are separated, men from women, parents from children, all forced to wear the shapeless uniform that marks them as society's failures. You pass close enough to see a line of people waiting for admission, their faces showing the particular blend of desperation and resignation that comes from having exhausted all other options. A woman clutches an infant to her chest, its thin wails barely audible over the street noise. An elderly man leans heavily on a wooden crutch, his empty trouser leg pinned up below the knee, probably a factory accident that left him unable to work. A family of 5, the children wide-eyed and silent, the parents avoiding each other's gaze, knowing they'll be separated once they cross that threshold. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, with its principle of less eligibility, ensures that conditions in the workhouse are deliberately worse than those of the lowest-paid laborer outside its walls. The theory is that this prevents the poor from choosing institutional support over work. In practice, it means that only the truly desperate seek the relief the workhouse offers. Inside, the day begins at 5 a.m. with watery gruel, followed by hours of menial, pointless labor designed more to punish than to produce. Oakum picking, unraveling old ropes until fingers bleed, stone breaking, bone crushing. Meals are meager, more gruel, occasionally supplemented with a small piece of cheese or meat of dubious origin. Silence is enforced during meals and work. Prayer is compulsory. Complaints are met with reduced rations or solitary confinement. Children born in the workhouse carry its stigma their entire lives. Workhouse bastard is an epithet that follows them into adulthood, closing doors of opportunity before they can even approach them. Many are apprenticed out as young as 7 or 8 to masters who work them as hard as adults for nothing more than room and board. The workhouse infirmary serves as Whitechapel's hospital of last resort. Its wards are overcrowded, understaffed, and under-equipped. Patients lie on straw mattresses, sometimes 2 or 3 to a bed. Treatment is basic at best, neglectful at worst. Death rates are high, and the dead are disposed of with minimal ceremony in mass graves or turned over to medical schools for dissection. You've heard whispers that some women, driven to desperation by unwanted pregnancy and lacking money for a proper abortionist, deliberately enter the workhouse in the later stages, hoping that the conditions, the poor food, hard labor, and generally unhygienic environment, will induce a miscarriage. Often they succeed, though sometimes at the cost of their own lives. And yet, despite all this, people go on. Somehow, they go to church on Sundays. They sing badly and pray quietly, and carry with them small bits of hope like cracked marbles in a pocket. Even the hopeless try. You find yourself near St. Jude's, one of Whitechapel's modestly appointed churches. It's not Sunday, but the doors stand open, offering a moment's respite from the world outside. You step in, not from religious feeling, but from curiosity about what draws people here week after week, despite evidence that their prayers go largely unanswered. The interior is cool and dim, smelling of old wood, candle wax, and the lingering hints of frankincense from the last service. A few scattered worshippers kneel in pews or before shrines, their lips moving in silent supplication. An elderly woman lights a votive candle, crossing herself as the flame catches. A man in workman's clothes sits with his cap in his hands, staring at the altar with red-rimmed eyes. What do they pray for? Relief from pain? Food for their children? A better job? Salvation? Or maybe just the strength to endure another day in Whitechapel without surrendering to despair or gin, or the muddy waters of the Thames. The Church of England offers spiritual comfort, but its practical assistance to the poor is limited and often comes with moral judgments attached. The clergy preach patience, temperance, and acceptance of one's station in life, while living in rectories far more comfortable than their parishioners' homes. Other denominations have made inroads in Whitechapel, each offering their own brand of solace. Methodists emphasize personal salvation and moral reform. Baptists promote adult baptism as a path to redemption. Catholics, often Irish immigrants, maintain their own parallel communities of faith. Salvation Army soldiers march through the streets offering hymns and hot soup in equal measure. For the Jewish residents of Whitechapel, synagogues serve as community centers as well as houses of worship. Mutual aid societies help new immigrants find housing and work. Religious traditions provide structure and meaning in a chaotic world. The kosher butcher shops, with their higher standards of cleanliness, sometimes attract non-Jewish customers willing to pay a little more for meat less likely to sicken their families. But faith alone isn't enough to sustain life in Whitechapel. For many, religion is just one thread in a complex tapestry of coping mechanisms. Alongside family bonds, neighborhood solidarity, the temporary oblivion of alcohol, and the grim humor that allows people to laugh at conditions that might otherwise drive them to madness. Superstition fills in the cracks where faith ran out. People talk of ghosts, demons, curses. They hang horseshoes over doors. They avoid the number 13. They believe the devil lives in fog or under bridges or on particularly bad nights in the eyes of a stranger who walks too quietly. In the pub on Commercial Street, you overhear a group of dock workers discussing recent events, their voices lowered despite the general din around them. "It ain't natural, what he does to them women," says one, a burly man with a beard stained yellow around the mouth from tobacco. "Cutting 'em up like that? Has to be the devil's work." His companion, thinner and nervous-looking, nods vigorously. "My missus won't go out after dark no more. Says she seen a shadow following her what didn't belong to nobody human. Had red eyes, she says." "My gran told me it's a golem," offers a third man, younger than the others, like from them Jewish stories. "Made of clay and brought to life with evil magic to kill Christians." The first man snorts. "Don't be daft. Ain't no clay monster. It's a toff playing games is what it is. Some doctor or lawyer who thinks we're all animals anyway." The debate continues, theories becoming more elaborate with each round of gin. None mention the more prosaic horrors that claim far more lives than any murderer. The factory accidents that crush limbs and sever fingers. The contaminated food that poisons entire families. The landlords who let buildings deteriorate until they collapse on sleeping tenants. It's easier perhaps to fear a monster than to confront the monstrous conditions that define daily existence in Whitechapel. You notice the subtle signs of superstition as you walk the streets. Chalk marks on doorways meant to ward off evil. Red threads tied around children's wrists to prevent disease. Iron nails hammered into thresholds to keep witches at bay. Sprigs of herbs hung in windows to purify the air against miasmas. A woman selling paper charms approaches you, her face deeply lined but her eyes sharp. "Protection, sir? Guaranteed to keep the Ripper away from your household." She holds out a crudely printed pamphlet covered in symbols that borrow indiscriminately from Christian, Jewish, and pagan traditions. You shake your head and move on, but notice others buying the worthless talismans, their expressions caught between skepticism and desperate hope. Who are you to judge them? In a world where medicine routinely fails and prayer often goes unanswered, perhaps magical thinking is a reasonable response. The resurgence of spiritualism among the middle and upper classes has trickled down to Whitechapel in distorted forms. Seances are conducted in back rooms of pubs where self-proclaimed mediums claim to contact the shades of murder victims, extracting lurid details that almost certainly come from imagination rather than the beyond. Fortune tellers do brisk business, especially among young women hoping to glimpse a future better than their present. Old pagan beliefs persist beneath the veneer of Christianity, particularly around births, deaths, and transitions. Mothers still place iron scissors under the beds of women in labor to cut the pain. Coins still cover the eyes of corpses to pay the ferryman. Rituals and rhymes passed down through generations offer the illusion of control in lives largely controlled by external forces. For recent immigrants, traditions brought from rural villages in Ireland, Eastern Europe, or further afield provide continuity and comfort in this alien urban landscape. They cling to familiar superstitions, even as they adapt to new surroundings, creating hybrid beliefs that puzzle outsiders but make perfect sense to those who hold them. You wonder if Jack considers himself subject to supernatural forces. Does he believe in God and the devil and fate? Or does he see himself as above such primitive concepts, a man of science practicing his own dark art in defiance of both religious and civil law? The police? Mostly useless, underpaid, overwhelmed, and not particularly interested if the victim wasn't someone important. They don't protect people. They just clean up afterwards, when they bother showing up at all. You spot a constable standing at a corner, his uniform neat but worn, his expression a careful blend of authority and boredom. His eyes scan the street with practiced indifference, seeing everything but acknowledging little. He knows better than to interfere in the minor illegalities that constitute daily life in Whitechapel. The unlicensed vendors, the street gamblers, the prostitutes plying their trade with minimal discretion. The Metropolitan Police, established just decades ago in 1829, remains an institution viewed with suspicion by many in Whitechapel. Their primary purpose, in the eyes of residents, is to protect property rather than people, to serve the interests of the wealthy rather than the needs of the poor. When violence erupts, a drunken brawl, a domestic dispute turned bloody, a robbery gone wrong, police response is slow and often perfunctory. Statements are taken, paperwork is filed, and little comes of it unless the victim has influence or the crime is particularly sensational. The murder of prostitutes would normally fall into the category of routine violence hardly worth investigating. What makes the Ripper killings different is their brutality, their frequency, and the growing public fascination with them. The press has seized on the story, forcing the police to at least appear to be making serious efforts to apprehend the killer. You see evidence of this increased attention in the additional constables patrolling Commercial Street and Flower and Dean Street, areas where the victims lived and worked. They move in pairs, lanterns illuminating little more than their immediate surroundings, the fog swallowing their light after a few feet. They look nervous, uncomfortable with their assignment, aware that they're likely being watched by the very predator they're seeking. The detectives from Scotland Yard fare little better. They arrive in their respectable suits, asking questions that betray their ignorance of Whitechapel's geography and social dynamics. They expect cooperation from a population conditioned by experience to distrust authority. They leave frustrated, with notebooks full of contradictory statements and false leads. The police force's structure itself hampers the investigation. Whitechapel straddles police districts, allowing the killer to slip between jurisdictions that communicate poorly with each other. Different investigative teams pursue different theories, sharing information reluctantly, if at all. Political pressure from above pushes for quick results rather than thorough methods. You wonder how much Jack knows about police procedures, whether he times and locates his crimes deliberately to exploit these weaknesses. Perhaps he studied their patrol patterns, their investigative techniques, their organizational blind spots, or perhaps he simply benefits from a system so broken that it can barely solve straightforward crimes, let alone catch a killer who seems to materialize from and vanish into the London fog at will. And then, of course, there's you, or at least the person you are now. You've become a rumor, a whisper passed between drinkers in smoky taverns, a name scribbled in blood across newspaper headlines, a shadow no one sees but everyone feels. Walking through Whitechapel in Jack's skin, you feel the collective fear like a tangible presence, as real as the fog that curls around street lamps and seeps under doors. It manifests in 100 small ways. The hurried pace of pedestrians as darkness falls, the wary glances over shoulders, the doors locked that once stood open, the windows shuttered despite the stuffy air inside. The newspapers feed this fear, competing for readers with increasingly sensational headlines. Fiend strikes again. Ripper taunts police. Whitechapel in terror. The penny dreadfuls go further, publishing lurid illustrations of imagined crime scenes and fictional accounts of near encounters with the killer. Street vendors sell Ripper memorabilia, crude maps marking murder locations, reproductions of supposed letters from the killer, even locks of hair claimed to be from victims. The grisly commerce disgusts you, but you understand its appeal. Fear becomes more manageable when packaged as entertainment, when horrors are assigned clear boundaries and sold for a penny a sheet. In pubs, self-appointed experts hold forth on the killer's identity, motives, and methods. Everyone has a theory, each more elaborate than the last. He's a doctor gone mad. He's a butcher with a grudge. He's a foreign prince. He's a respected businessman. He's a woman disguised as a man. He's not one person, but many working together. He's a supernatural entity, a revenant, a demon in human form. The theories reveal more about the theorists than about Jack himself, their prejudices, their anxieties, their secret fascinations with violence. They speak of him with a disturbing mixture of fear and admiration, casting him as both monster and artist, villain and anti-hero. Women clutch their shawls tighter when they walk at night. Men pretend they're not scared and walk faster anyway. You've turned fear into a shape, a silhouette, something tall and quiet and wrong. You see a woman hesitate before turning down a narrow lane, gathering her courage before plunging into shadows that never concerned her before September. You see a man check over his shoulder repeatedly as he walks home alone, his hand in his pocket probably gripping a knife or makeshift weapon. You see children called in from play earlier than usual, doors locked behind them, windows checked twice. The East End has never been safe, but it's always had its own rhythms and rules that allowed residents to navigate its dangers. Jack has disrupted those patterns, introduced new and unpredictable threats that the community's standard defenses can't address. How do you protect yourself against a killer who leaves no witnesses, who approaches without warning, who could be anyone? The vulnerability of women is particularly pronounced. Those who work the streets face an impossible choice: risk death to earn enough for a night's lodging, or avoid the danger and face certain cold, hunger, and exposure. Many travel in pairs now, sharing the risk and the diminished earnings. Others seek protection from men who extract payment in various forms for their companionship, trading one form of exploitation for another. Even women not engaged in prostitution feel the heightened danger. Factory girls walk home in groups, linking arms against both the literal darkness and the metaphorical shadow that has fallen over Whitechapel. Domestic servants negotiate with employers to adjust their hours, avoiding journeys after nightfall. Wives send male relatives to run errands that once fell to them. Men in Whitechapel, accustomed to thinking of violence as something that happens between men, a fair fight, however brutal, find themselves unsettled by this new form of predation. Their usual bravado feels hollow against a threat that strikes from hiding, that targets the vulnerable rather than challenging the strong. They respond with a mixture of protective impulses toward their women and a general hostility toward strangers that sometimes erupts into misdirected violence. You didn't mean to, or maybe you did. Maybe the city made you. Maybe you're just its reflection, a monster molded by mold and fog and the sound of boots in alleys. Walking in Jack's skin, feeling the hunger that drives him, you wonder about his origins. Was he born to this, somehow defective from the start? Or did the city shape him, turn him from a troubled but ordinary man into the killer who now haunts both its streets and your consciousness? London in 1888 has all the ingredients to create monsters: extreme poverty alongside ostentatious wealth, brutal working conditions that crush body and spirit, education and opportunity hoarded by those who need them least, widespread alcoholism offering temporary escape at the cost of deeper degradation, violence normalized, from the casual beating of wives and children to the public executions that draw crowds like theater. Perhaps Jack began as one of Whitechapel's countless invisible people, a laborer broken by work, a clerk dismissed without cause, a patient mistreated by the medical establishment, a child abused in a workhouse. Perhaps his pathology grew from seeds planted by the same systems that create the everyday suffering all around you. Or perhaps he comes from outside, one of the comfortable classes who view the East End as a different world, a place to slum for entertainment or to project their own darkest impulses. Perhaps he studied medicine in schools that treated the poor as teaching material, learning to see human bodies as objects for examination rather than vessels of humanity. The truth might lie somewhere between, a man shaped by both personal trauma and societal failings, neither wholly victim nor entirely self-made monster. The boundary between victim and perpetrator has always been more permeable than comfortable morality allows. In a place where life is short, brutal, and cheap, you're not the only darkness. You're just the one with a name. You pass an alley where a man beats a woman methodically, his fists rising and falling in a rhythm as regular as factory machinery. No one intervenes. No one even seems to notice. It's not murder after all, just ordinary violence, the background noise of Whitechapel life. In a sweatshop visible through an uncurtained window, children as young as 6 or 7 hunch over piecework, their small fingers manipulating fabric for 14-16 hours a day, their growth stunted, their lungs filled with textile dust, their futures foreclosed before they've properly begun. Not murder, exactly. Just slow death for profit. Outside a gin palace, a woman lies unconscious, her clothing disarranged, her breathing shallow. Passers-by step around her without pausing. Whether she drinks to escape physical pain, mental anguish, or memories of abuse, the result is the same. Another life eroding drop by drop. Not murder, just socially acceptable self-destruction. In a respectable office across the city, men in suits make decisions about housing regulations, food standards, and factory conditions based on calculations that never factor in the human cost of their economies. Their actions, or inactions, kill more efficiently than any lone murderer could dream of. Not murder, legally speaking. Just business. Jack kills individually, intimately with his hands. Society kills wholesale, impersonally, by policy and neglect. Both transform living beings into objects, into statistics, into problems to be solved or disposed of. The difference is largely aesthetic, and even that name, it's not really yours. Jack the Ripper, a name from a letter that may not even be authentic, adopted by the press, embraced by the public, imposed on killings that might not all be connected. A label that transforms mundane horror into mythic terror, that elevates one man's psychiatric break or calculated sadism into a symbol for an age's collective fears. You wonder what name he used before the papers gave him this one, what he calls himself in his own mind, whether he embraces the nom de guerre or resents its theatrical flair, whether, like you, he sometimes feels trapped in an identity he didn't choose, but now can't escape. The real Jack, the man whose skin you inhabit, remains unknowable, his true motives and identity lost to history. But perhaps that's fitting. In becoming a cipher, a blank space onto which Victorian society projected its darkest anxieties, he fulfilled his most essential function, holding up a blood-streaked mirror to a civilization that preferred not to acknowledge its own capacity for violence. As night falls completely over Whitechapel, you find yourself back at the lodging house, climbing the narrow stairs to Jack's room. Inside, you remove your coat and sit on the edge of the bed, contemplating what you've learned about the world that created him. Tomorrow you'll wake up as Jack again. You'll walk these dismal streets, interact with people whose lives are shaped by forces beyond their control, just as yours is now shaped by his inexplicable, terrible hungers. You'll witness the daily tragedies that never make headlines, the quiet suffering that fades into the background of history, and perhaps you'll understand a little better why London remembers Jack, why his shadow stretches across centuries, while countless other victims of Victorian England lie in unmarked graves, their stories untold, their suffering unacknowledged, not because he was unique in his capacity for violence, but because he showed Victorian society exactly what it was capable of creating and what it preferred to deny. A few important things that happened while you were Jack. Public health initiatives addressed some of the sanitation issues that had plagued the district. Water quality improved. Street lighting became more comprehensive. Educational opportunities expanded gradually through board schools and settlement house programs. The Jewish population continued to grow as more refugees arrived from Eastern Europe, establishing stronger community institutions and gradually improving their economic position through small businesses and skilled trades. Other immigrant groups followed similar trajectories, creating the multicultural East End that would later become known for its diversity rather than just its poverty. The women of Whitechapel, including those engaged in prostitution, saw some changes in their circumstances. The creation of women's trade unions improved conditions in factories and workshops. Charitable organizations established more shelters and training programs. The feminist movement began addressing issues of violence against women, though progress was slow and uneven. Meanwhile, the Ripper entered the realm of legend. By the early 20th century, he had become a fixture of popular culture, featured in melodramas, penny dreadfuls, and early films. Writers like Robert Louis Stevenson, whose Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde predated but seemed to presage the Ripper, explored the theme of respectable men with monstrous hidden selves. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, though never officially tackling the Ripper, emerged from and responded to the same cultural anxieties about crime and detection in the modern city. The case became a touchstone for discussions about urban danger, the limits of police work, violence against women, class divisions, and the nature of evil. Each generation reinterpreted it according to their own concerns and perspectives, finding in the shadowy figure of the unidentified killer a screen onto which they could project their particular fears and fascinations. For the actual residents of Whitechapel, however, Jack gradually faded from immediate concern into historical background. Their neighborhood would face new challenges: the crushing poverty of the Depression, the bombs of 2 world wars, post-war redevelopment that erased much of the Victorian streetscape, waves of new immigration that transformed the cultural landscape. The Ripper became part of local lore, a story to tell visitors rather than an active threat. The physical traces of the murders slowly disappeared. Durward Street, formerly Bucks Row, where Marianne Nichols was killed, was eventually redeveloped. The spot where Annie Chapman died behind 29 Hanbury Street was demolished to make way for brewery extensions. Dutefield's Yard, where Elizabeth Stride was found, changed beyond recognition. Mitre Square, site of Catherine Eddowes' murder, was rebuilt after bomb damage in the Blitz. Miller's Court, where Mary Jane Kelly lived and died, was torn down in 1928. Today, little remains that Jack would recognize if he somehow returned to his hunting grounds. The narrow alleys have been widened. The common lodging houses have been replaced by council housing and later by private developments. The pubs where the victims drank have mostly closed or been renovated beyond recognition. Even the thick London fog, that iconic element of the Ripper story, has dissipated thanks to the Clean Air Acts that reduced coal smoke. Yet the murders themselves refuse to fade completely into history. Each year, tens of thousands of visitors take Ripper walking tours, following guides who recreate the events of 1888 on streets now lined with coffee shops and tech startups. Books proposing new theories about the killer's identity continue to be published. Documentaries and films retell the story for new audiences. The case remains the most famous unsolved murder mystery in history, its enduring appeal a testament to its perfect combination of horror, mystery, and social commentary. What would you make of this afterlife, this transformation from brutal killer to tourist attraction? Would you be flattered by the attention or disgusted by the commercialization? Would you recognize yourself in the various portrayals? Or would you find them as fictitious as the penny dreadful villains that preceded you? The cultural impact. From crime to myth, the transformation of the Whitechapel murders from historical events to cultural phenomenon began almost immediately. Even before the killings ended, entrepreneurs were capitalizing on public fascination, offering Ripper-themed entertainment and souvenirs. Madame Tussauds added a wax figure of Jack the Ripper to its Chamber of Horrors by December 1888, despite no one knowing what he looked like. Theater productions based on the murders appeared within months, thinly disguised with altered names to avoid censorship. A melodrama called The Whitechapel Demon opened in a London theater while police were still actively investigating. Music hall performers incorporated references to the case in their songs and comedy routines, often reflecting working-class gallows humor about the dangers of their own neighborhoods. By the early 20th century, the Ripper had become a standard character in popular fiction, particularly in the emerging genre of detective stories. While Arthur Conan Doyle never directly addressed the Ripper in his Sherlock Holmes stories, many other writers created fictional detectives who succeeded where the real police had failed, solving thinly disguised versions of the Whitechapel murders. Marie Belloc-Lowndes' 1913 novel, The Lodger, introduced one of the most influential fictional interpretations of the Ripper, a mysterious boarder whose nocturnal habits aroused the suspicions of his landlady. The story has been adapted for film multiple times, most notably by Alfred Hitchcock in 1927, and established many of the tropes that would define Ripper fiction for decades to come. Cinema embraced the Ripper with particular enthusiasm. Beyond the adaptations of The Lodger, countless films have featured the killer or variations of him, from serious historical dramas to exploitation horror. The visual iconography became standardized: fog-shrouded streets, gas lamps casting long shadows, a dark figure in a top hat and cape, gleaming surgical instruments, terrified women in Victorian dress. This cinematic Ripper bore little resemblance to any plausible historical suspect. The top hat and cape, now such recognizable elements of the Ripper image, had no basis in witness statements or evidence. They derived instead from theatrical conventions used to signify villainy and from class anxieties about wealthy predators stalking poor neighborhoods. Similarly, the medical bag full of surgical instruments reflected theories about the killer's profession rather than any items actually found at crime scenes. The transition from historical criminal to mythic figure accelerated in the mid-20th century as scholars, amateur detectives, and writers began publishing books proposing specific suspects. Surgeon Sir William Gull, painter Walter Sickert, mathematician Lewis Carroll, American serial killer H.H. Holmes, medium Robert Lees. Each new theory added layers to the mythology, often with little regard for historical evidence or practical plausibility. The most sensational theories gained particular cultural traction, especially those implicating the British royal family. The notion that Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, was involved, whether as the killer himself or as part of a conspiracy to cover up his indiscretions, has proven remarkably durable despite overwhelming evidence against it. It appeared in Stephen Knight's 1976 book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, was adapted into Alan Moore's graphic novel From Hell, later made into a Hollywood film, and continues to circulate in popular culture. These increasingly elaborate theories reflect the Ripper's evolution from a specific historical criminal to a mythic archetype embodying various societal fears: anxiety about urban anonymity, distrust of authority, concerns about class exploitation, fears of medical experimentation, xenophobic suspicion of foreigners, fascination with sexual deviancy, and paranoia about elite conspiracies. By the late 20th century, Jack the Ripper had been fully absorbed into global popular culture, recognizable far beyond Britain. He appeared in episodes of Star Trek, inspired characters in anime and manga, featured in video games, and became a staple of Halloween imagery alongside fictional monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein's creation. Academic interest in the case developed alongside popular fascination. Scholars from various disciplines, history, criminology, gender studies, media studies, urban sociology, began analyzing the murders not just as a crime to be solved, but as a cultural phenomenon to be understood. They examined how the case revealed Victorian attitudes toward gender, class, and violence, how media coverage shaped public perception, how the urban environment influenced both the crimes and the response to them. For many scholars, the enduring fascination with the Ripper reveals more about subsequent generations than about the original murders. Each era has reinterpreted the case according to its own concerns. Victorians saw it as evidence of urban degeneration. Early 20th century writers viewed it through the lens of emerging psychological theories. Mid-century analysts incorporated forensic advances and profiling techniques. Late 20th century interpretations often focused on gender and power. 21st century approaches frequently emphasize the victim's stories and social contexts. The internet age has transformed Ripper studies further, creating global communities of researchers and enthusiasts who debate theories in online forums, share digitized historical documents, and conduct collaborative investigations. The democratization of information has both enhanced research opportunities and enabled the rapid spread of misinformation and speculation. Modern Ripper tourism represents the culmination of this cultural evolution. The East End, once avoided by respectable Londoners, now draws visitors specifically because of its association with the murders. Walking tours visit approximations of crime scenes. Museums display artifacts and reconstructions. Gift shops sell Ripper-themed merchandise. The economically disadvantaged area that once housed the victims now profits, however problematically, from their deaths. This commercialization raises complex ethical questions about the exploitation of tragedy for entertainment, the glamorization of violence against women, and the distortion of historical understanding. Some modern tours and presentations make concerted efforts to emphasize the victims' humanity and the social conditions that made them vulnerable, but others continue to treat them as props in a macabre spectacle. For you, experiencing this history from inside Jack's skin, these cultural interpretations must seem particularly surreal. The gap between whatever reality Jack experienced and the mythic figure he became is likely vast. The mundane details of his daily existence, where he ate, how he earned money, what he thought about during ordinary moments, have been replaced by sensationalized imaginings of his crimes and motivations. The suspects, theories, and accusations. Over the years, more than 100 individuals have been proposed as suspects in the Whitechapel murders, ranging from plausible local residents to international celebrities to members of the royal family. Some theories emerged during the original investigation. Others were developed decades or even centuries later based on reinterpretations of evidence or entirely new claims. The most credible suspects tend to be ordinary men who lived or worked in or near Whitechapel, had some anatomical knowledge, and exhibited behaviors consistent with violent tendencies. These include Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who committed suicide shortly after the last canonical murder; Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew with mental illness who was institutionalized; and James Maybrick, a cotton merchant whose purported diary, discovered in 1992, claimed responsibility for the crimes. Medical professionals figure prominently among the suspects due to the anatomical knowledge supposedly displayed in the mutilations. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who was in London during the murders and had a collection of female organs; Thomas Neil Cream, a verified poisoner of women; and Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born thief and fraud who claimed medical training, were all considered by police at various times. Slaughterhouse workers and butchers were also logical suspects given their familiarity with animal anatomy and access to sharp implements. Jacob Levy, a butcher who worked in Whitechapel and was later committed to an asylum, has been proposed by some researchers as a plausible candidate. Some of the most enduring theories involve elaborate conspiracies, often centered around the British establishment. Sir William Gull, physician to Queen Victoria, has been accused of conducting the murders as part of a Masonic plot to conceal Prince Albert Victor's secret marriage to a Catholic shopgirl. While dramatic and appealing to anti-establishment sentiment, these theories typically rely on dubious evidence and implausible scenarios. Artists and writers have attracted particular interest from some theorists. Walter Sickert, a painter whose work sometimes featured themes of violence against women, was proposed as the Ripper by crime novelist Patricia Cornwell, who went so far as to purchase and destroy some of his paintings in search of DNA evidence. Lewis Carroll, author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, has been suggested based on anagram evidence and psychological speculation. These theories typically say more about the theorist's imagination than about historical reality. The Mad Doctor remains one of the most persistent archetypes in Ripper theories, reflecting Victorian anxieties about medical science and its potentially dehumanizing effects. Various physicians, surgeons, and medical students have been proposed over the years, often with little evidence beyond their profession and proximity to Whitechapel. This focus on medical suspects reflects both the perceived anatomical knowledge displayed in the murders and deeper cultural fears about scientific authority and experimentation. Foreign suspects have featured prominently in many theories, reflecting the xenophobia of both Victorian society and subsequent eras. Seweryn Klusowski, also known as George Chapman, a Polish barber who later poisoned several women; Karl Feigenbaum, a German merchant seaman executed in New York for murder; and a Malay cook, described by various witnesses but never identified, have all been proposed, often with evidence as thin as their non-British origins. Some modern theories have suggested that the killer may have been a woman, arguing that female perpetrators were less likely to attract suspicion and could move more freely among potential victims. Mary Piercy, executed in 1890 for murdering her lover's wife and child, has been proposed based on similarities in her crime to the Ripper murders. While interesting as a challenge to gender assumptions, these theories typically lack compelling evidence. The latest generation of suspects emerges from more sophisticated analysis of geographical profiling, psychiatric understanding of serial killers, and detailed examination of witness statements. Researchers like Hallie Rubenhold have shifted focus away from the perpetrator to the victims, arguing that understanding their lives and circumstances reveals more about the historical significance of the cases than endless speculation about the killer's identity. Modern DNA testing has attempted to resolve the mystery, with researchers examining items purportedly connected to the case, such as the From Hell letter and James Maybrick's diary. However, chain of custody issues, contamination problems, and questions about the authenticity of the items themselves have prevented any definitive conclusions. The truth is that we will likely never know for certain who Jack the Ripper was. The evidence is too fragmentary, too contaminated by time and handling, too distorted by myth-making and speculation. The case remains eternally open, a mystery that resists solution despite, or perhaps because of, the thousands of hours of investigation devoted to it over more than a century. For you, occupying Jack's consciousness, the irony must be particularly acute. You experience his thoughts, his movements, his daily existence, yet even you cannot be certain of his identity or the full extent of his actions. You are simultaneously inside the mystery and outside it, participant and observer in a story that continues to unfold long after its principal characters have turned to dust. The East End. After Jack. The East End that Jack knew underwent profound transformations in the decades following the murders. Some changes were direct responses to the killings and the attention they drew to the area's conditions. Others resulted from broader social, economic, and political developments that would have occurred regardless. In the immediate aftermath, some tangible improvements appeared. Street lighting was enhanced, particularly in the dark courts and alleys that had provided cover for the killer. Police patrols increased permanently in certain areas. Some of the worst lodging houses were closed or reformed under stricter regulation, though affordable housing remained scarce. The murders accelerated existing reform movements by drawing unprecedented attention to East End conditions. Charles Booth's poverty maps and the accompanying study, Life and Labor of the People in London, begun before the Ripper but published after, gained wider readership due to public interest in Whitechapel. The maps color-coded London streets according to income and class, visually demonstrating the concentration of extreme poverty in the East End. Housing reform gained momentum in the 1890s and early 1900s. The London County Council, established in 1889, began clearing slums and constructing public housing, though not nearly enough to meet demand. Philanthropic organizations, like the Peabody Trust and the East End Dwellings Company, built model housing blocks designed to provide better conditions at affordable rents, though these often ended up serving the respectable working poor rather than the truly destitute. Public health initiatives addressed some of the sanitation issues that had made diseases endemic in the area. Water supply improved with the completion of major infrastructure projects. Food safety regulations became stricter. Medical services expanded gradually, though they remained inadequate for the population's needs. The Jewish community that had featured prominently in Ripper coverage, often in anti-Semitic contexts, continued to develop its presence in the East End. Synagogues, schools, friendly societies, and cultural organizations flourished, creating a rich communal life despite ongoing prejudice. The Jewish East End became known for political activism, labor organization, and intellectual ferment, as well as traditional religious practice. Working conditions improved incrementally through a combination of labor organization, legislative reform, and technological change. The Match Girls' strike of 1888, which coincided with the early Ripper murders, set a precedent for successful industrial action by women workers. Trade unions expanded their membership among previously unorganized groups, including women and unskilled workers. Factory acts extended protection to more categories of workers and strengthened enforcement mechanisms. Women's lives in particular saw gradual changes that might have prevented some of the vulnerabilities that made the Ripper's victims accessible to him. Female suffrage campaigns gained momentum, though women wouldn't gain equal voting rights until 1928. Educational opportunities expanded, with more girls remaining in school longer. Employment options diversified beyond domestic service and the most exploitative factory work. Women's trade unions advocated for better conditions and equal pay, though gender discrimination remained entrenched. Prostitution, which had featured so prominently in Ripper coverage, remained common in the East End but evolved in response to changing conditions. Increased police attention made street solicitation riskier, pushing some women into brothels or other indoor arrangements. Economic alternatives remained limited but gradually expanded, allowing some women to avoid or exit sex work. Social attitudes shifted slowly toward understanding prostitution as resulting from economic necessity rather than moral depravity, though stigmatization continued. 2 world wars dramatically impacted the East End. German Zeppelin raids in World War I and the Blitz in World War II destroyed significant portions of the area's housing stock and infrastructure. The East End's docks made it a strategic target, and its working-class residents bore a disproportionate share of civilian casualties and displacement. The post-World War II period brought the most dramatic physical changes to the area Jack would have known. Comprehensive redevelopment cleared bomb-damaged areas and many intact but substandard buildings. Victorian terraces and courts were replaced by modernist housing estates. Streets were widened, open spaces created, and infrastructure modernized according to contemporary planning principles that often disregarded historical street patterns and community ties. Deindustrialization in the late 20th century transformed the economic base of the East End. The once bustling docks closed as shipping containerization made them obsolete. Factories relocated to areas with cheaper land and labor. Traditional industries like tailoring declined in the face of globalization and changing consumer habits. Unemployment rose, particularly among men who had worked in industrial and dock jobs. New waves of immigration changed the area's demographic composition. The Jewish population gradually dispersed to other parts of London, replaced by Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Caribbean immigrants who created their own community institutions and cultural presences. More recently, gentrification has brought young professionals and artists to parts of the East End, driving up property values and creating new patterns of economic disparity alongside the old. Today's East End bears little physical resemblance to the area Jack knew. Brick Lane, once part of the impoverished district where his victims lived, is now famous for curry restaurants, vintage shops, and street art. Commercial Street hosts fashion boutiques rather than sweatshops. Spitalfields Market sells artisanal goods to tourists instead of cheap necessities to local residents. Yet some continuities persist beneath the transformed surface. The East End remains one of London's poorer areas, with pockets of severe deprivation amid increasing wealth. Economic inequality is still starkly visible in the juxtaposition of luxury apartments and public housing estates. Residents still include recent immigrants seeking better lives, workers struggling with low wages and insecure employment, and those who have been left behind by economic changes they had no part in creating. If Jack somehow returned to his old hunting grounds, he would find the physical environment transformed beyond recognition, but some of the underlying social dynamics disturbingly familiar. The vulnerable still exist alongside the privileged. The desperate still make difficult choices for survival. The powerful still often ignore or exploit the powerless. The myth of linear progress, of society steadily improving for all its members, remains as questionable now as it was in Victorian London. The legacy of fear, the impact of the Ripper murders extended far beyond their immediate victims and location. They created a template for understanding and fearing violent crime that continues to influence public consciousness and institutional responses more than a century later. The case transformed perceptions of urban space, particularly for women. Cities had always contained dangers, but the Ripper crystallized a specific fear: the anonymous predator who could strike at random in public spaces. The murders reinforced the notion that cities themselves were inherently dangerous, especially at night, and especially for women who ventured beyond prescribed boundaries. This fear had tangible effects on women's freedom of movement and access to public space. The advice given to women during the Ripper's activities: don't go out alone, avoid certain areas, don't trust strangers, has been repeated with variations whenever similar crimes occur. These cautionary messages, however well-intentioned, place the burden of prevention on potential victims rather than addressing the underlying causes of violence. The case also shaped how society categorizes and responds to serial murder. Jack the Ripper's crimes defined a pattern, a killer targeting a specific type of victim with a recognizable modus operandi that would become the template for understanding subsequent serial killers. The concept wasn't named until the 20th century, but the Ripper provided the archetypal example that influenced both public perception and law enforcement approaches. Media coverage of violent crime still follows patterns established during the Ripper case. The same elements persist: sensationalist headlines, graphic details, speculation about the perpetrator's motives and identity, a focus on the most bizarre or shocking aspects rather than underlying social factors. The "if it bleeds, it leads" approach to crime reporting that emerged in the 1880s continues to drive news coverage and public fascination. The murders reinforced class-based fears in ways that still resonate. For the middle and upper classes, the Ripper represented the perceived savagery lurking within poor neighborhoods, the dangers that might emerge from those areas to threaten respectable society. For working-class residents, he represented the predatory aspects of authority: the surgeon, the gentleman, the foreigner, the policeman, who might exploit their vulnerability with impunity. These class-inflected fears continue to influence how crime is perceived and addressed. Violent crimes in affluent areas receive different coverage and often different police responses than similar incidents in poor neighborhoods. Stranger danger receives disproportionate attention compared to more common forms of violence that occur within familiar relationships. The fascination with unusual or extreme cases diverts attention from everyday violence that claims far more victims. Even the language used to discuss the Ripper has shaped subsequent discourse about violence against women. The persistent focus on the victim's involvement in prostitution, often presented as if it were the defining feature of their lives, reinforced the notion that some women are more deserving victims than others. This hierarchy of victimhood continues to influence media coverage, public sympathy, and sometimes even official responses to violence against women. The failure to solve the case has had its own legacy, creating an entire subculture of amateur detectives and fueling persistent distrust of official narratives. The Ripper industry of books, tours, museums, and websites represents more than just commercial exploitation of tragedy. It reflects a genuine public desire to resolve historical ambiguities and perhaps symbolically restore order to a narrative that resists closure. This desire for resolution extends beyond the Ripper to other unsolved cases. Each new high-profile murder or disappearance inevitably draws comparisons to the Whitechapel killings, particularly if it remains unsolved. The Ripper has become shorthand for the limits of justice, the possibility that some killers might escape identification entirely, leaving their motives and methods forever mysterious. For the modern East End, the Ripper's legacy is complicated by tourism and popular culture. An area once avoided by outsiders now draws visitors specifically because of its association with gruesome murders. This attention brings economic benefits but also perpetuates a one-dimensional view of the neighborhood's rich and complex history. Residents find themselves living in spaces simultaneously real and mythologized, their everyday experiences overshadowed by events that occurred more than a century ago. The most profound legacy of the Ripper may be the questions his crimes continue to raise about the nature of evil, the organization of society, and the treatment of the vulnerable. Was he a unique monster or a product of his environment? Did his crimes reveal flaws in the social system, or merely in one individual's psyche? Does our continued fascination with him reflect historical interest, or something darker in our own collective consciousness? These questions have no definitive answers, but they continue to resonate because they touch on fundamental aspects of human experience and social organization. The Ripper case, for all its specificity to Victorian London, speaks to universal concerns about violence, justice, gender, class, and the dark potential that exists alongside civilization's achievements. The true legacy: more rules, more fear, but also more headlines, more fiction, more fascination. You became a story, a very old one that still makes people lean in closer, even when they say they don't believe in monsters. But here's the thing. The most interesting part of the story was never you. It was the world that made you possible. The alleyways, the silence, the cold, and the people who lived there, not to scare anyone but just to survive. Beyond the shadow of the knife, the true legacy of the Whitechapel murders lies not in the identity of the killer, but in what they revealed about Victorian society and how that revelation continues to resonate. Jack the Ripper matters not because he was an exceptionally prolific or skilled murderer. He wasn't by the standards of serial killers, but because his crimes exposed the fault lines running through the heart of the British Empire at its zenith. The murders laid bare the extreme inequality that characterized Victorian London, forcing the comfortable classes to acknowledge, however briefly, the desperate conditions in which the poor lived. They revealed the vulnerability of women in a society that offered them few economic opportunities and little protection under the law. They demonstrated the limitations of early policing and forensic techniques. They showcased the emerging power of mass media to shape public perception and create cultural narratives. Most importantly, they highlighted the dual nature of Victorian morality: outwardly proper and restrained, inwardly fascinated by violence and sexuality. The public could simultaneously condemn the killer and consume every lurid detail of his crimes. They could express sympathy for the victims while implicitly blaming them for their immoral lifestyles. They could demand police action while hindering investigations through hysteria and false reports. This duality persists in the modern fascination with the case. Contemporary Ripper tourism, literature, and media often reproduce the same tensions, commercializing tragedy while claiming historical interest, focusing on the killer while professing concern for the victims, sensationalizing violence while condemning it. When you walk through Whitechapel in Jack's body, you're not just inhabiting a killer. You're inhabiting a symbol, a cultural touchstone that has come to represent far more than the sum of the actual crimes. You carry not just the weight of 5 murders, but the accumulated weight of more than a century of speculation, mythologizing, and projection of societal fears. The irony is that Jack, whoever he was, likely never intended to become an emblematic figure. His motives, whether driven by psychopathology, misogyny, or some complex blend of personal and social factors, were almost certainly more mundane than the grand theories later imposed on them. Yet, in becoming unidentifiable, he became infinitely interpretable. A blank slate onto which each generation could project its own anxieties about violence, gender, class, and urban life. Reclaiming the victims' stories. The 5 canonical victims, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, deserve recognition not just as entries in a killer's ledger, but as women who struggled against overwhelming odds. Their lives, though cut short, exemplified the resilience of those who endured Victorian poverty. Recent scholarship has worked to reconstruct their biographies, to see them as full human beings rather than merely unfortunates or prostitutes. Their stories reveal much about the lives of working-class women in Victorian London. Most had been married and had children. All had worked legitimate jobs at various points: domestic service, laundry work, farming, charring, cleaning houses, needlework. All had experienced the precariousness of female existence in an era when women had few legal rights and even fewer economic opportunities. All turned to casual prostitution, not from moral failing, but from the simple need to secure food and shelter when other options failed. Mary Ann Nichols, beyond being the Ripper's first canonical victim, was a woman who had once maintained a stable home with her husband and 5 children. After her marriage dissolved, not, as was often reported, due to her drinking, but more likely due to her husband's infidelity, she struggled to find work that would support her. She moved between workhouses, lodging houses, and the homes of family members, working as a domestic servant and charwoman when possible. In the last months of her life, she had finally secured regular cleaning work and written to her father that she would soon be able to get money from some quarter. This letter, sent just days before her death, reveals a woman actively trying to improve her circumstances, not the passive victim or hopeless drunk portrayed in many accounts. Annie Chapman had lived a lower middle-class life before a series of personal tragedies. Her husband, a coachman, died of alcoholism. Her elder daughter died of meningitis. Her younger daughter lived with a relative due to Annie's inability to support her. Before her descent into poverty, Annie had kept a home, raised children, and lived within the boundaries of respectable Victorian womanhood. Her final years were marked by illness as well as poverty. She suffered from tuberculosis and other ailments that limited her ability to work consistently. Friends described her as intelligent and well-spoken, a woman who retained her dignity despite her circumstances. Elizabeth Stride's life story illustrates the particular vulnerabilities of immigrant women. Born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden, she came to London after working as a domestic servant in Sweden and possibly other countries. She married John Stride, giving her British citizenship, but was widowed in her 40s. Without family networks for support, she relied on assistance from the Swedish Church in London, as well as her own earnings from charring, cleaning, and occasional prostitution. Her fabricated story about losing her husband and children in a disaster reveals a poignant attempt to create a more sympathetic narrative for herself than the reality of abandonment and gradual decline into poverty. Catherine Eddowes led a more mobile life than was typical for working-class Victorian women. With her common-law husband Thomas Conway, she traveled around the Midlands selling chapbooks, small cheap booklets of popular literature, and doing seasonal agricultural work. This peripatetic existence, while precarious, suggests a woman who sought opportunities beyond the conventional female roles of her time. After separating from Conway, she lived with John Kelly in London, maintaining a relationship that by all accounts was affectionate despite their poverty. On the night of her death, she had been arrested for public drunkenness, a common fate for homeless or precariously housed women who had nowhere private to drink, and released from custody just an hour before her encounter with the killer. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest and most mysterious victim, presents the greatest challenge to biographers. Her background is largely constructed from her own varying accounts, which may have been embellished or invented to appeal to different listeners, or to conceal aspects of her past she preferred not to discuss. She claimed Irish origins and a marriage at 16, followed by widowhood when her husband died in a mining accident. She may have worked in a high-class West End brothel before moving to the East End, suggesting a downward social trajectory that was not uncommon for women in the sex trade as they aged. Unlike the other victims, who were killed on the street, Mary Jane died in her own room, where she brought clients, a space that, however humble, represented a degree of independence and stability the other women lacked at the ends of their lives. These brief sketches barely scratch the surface of these women's experiences, but they begin to restore the humanity that was stripped from them, first by their killer and then by the press and public, that reduced them to lurid headlines and moral object lessons. The victims were neither saints nor irredeemable sinners. They were complex individuals navigating a society that offered them few options and less compassion. The true horror of the Ripper case lies not in the grotesque details of the killings, but but in the social conditions that made the victims vulnerable in the first place. It lies in a system that created such extreme poverty alongside extreme wealth, that offered women so few paths to independence, that treated the poor as moral failures rather than victims of structural inequality. A society reflected in violence. Jack himself, whoever he was, remains less interesting than the world that produced him and the world that remembers him. He was perhaps a unique individual with specific psychological pathologies, but he was also a product of his time and place. The Victorian fascination with anatomy, surgery, and death, the treatment of women's bodies as objects for control and study, the class divisions that rendered the poor virtually invisible except when they caused trouble. All these cultural factors shaped both his actions and the response to them. The late Victorian period was marked by profound anxieties about degeneration, contamination, and moral decline. Theories of criminal anthropology, popularized by figures like Cesare Lombroso, suggested that criminals could be identified by physical characteristics that marked them as evolutionary throwbacks. Newspapers routinely described the poor as a separate race, with different moral and physical characteristics from the middle and upper classes. Social Darwinist ideas justified inequality as the natural result of competition between the fit and unfit. Against this backdrop, the Ripper murders reinforced certain fears while challenging others. The killer's apparent ability to blend into society, to move undetected among both the poor of Whitechapel and potentially the more respectable residents of other areas, threatened the comforting belief that evil would always be visibly marked. The anatomical nature of the mutilations suggested not primitive savagery, but a perversion of modern medical knowledge, raising uncomfortable questions about the darker potentials of civilized skills. The murders also occurred during a period of intense debate about women's roles, rights, and sexuality. The 1880s saw the emergence of the new woman, who sought education, independence, and greater social and political freedom. Conservative backlash against these changes often focused on fears about female sexuality and its potentially destructive power if not properly contained within marriage. The Rippers' targeting of prostitutes, women who explicitly traded on their sexuality outside of sanctioned relationships, can be read as an extreme manifestation of the desire to control and punish female sexual autonomy. The case unfolded against a background of growing labor, unrest, and political radicalization. The Bloody Sunday riots of 1887, the Match Girls' strike of 1888, and the Great Dock Strike of 1889 all occurred in or near the East End, making the area a site of particular concern for authorities worried about potential revolution. Some contemporary observers explicitly connected the murders to this political context, suggesting that the killer might be an anarchist or socialist seeking to destabilize society or draw attention to the conditions of the poor, though no evidence supported these theories. Immigration and ethnic tensions provided another layer of context for the crimes. The influx of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe had changed the demographic composition of Whitechapel, creating resentment among some native-born residents who saw the newcomers as economic competition and cultural threats. Anti-Semitic suspicions featured prominently in public discourse about the murders, despite police statements clearing specific Jewish suspects and the lack of evidence connecting the crimes to any ethnic or religious group. These intersecting anxieties about class, gender, politics, and ethnicity created a perfect storm of projected fears around the Ripper case. The killer became a lightning rod for multiple, often contradictory concerns about the direction of British society. A blank figure onto which different groups could project their particular nightmares about what might be lurking in the shadows of the world's most powerful empire. Beyond the individual, structural violence in Victorian society, the East End that you've inhabited during your strange journey through Jack's consciousness, was a place of contradictions. It contained crushing poverty, but also remarkable resilience, exploitation, but also solidarity, danger, but also community. Its residents were victims of larger social forces, but also agents of their own lives, finding ways to create meaning and connection amid deprivation. The structural violence of Victorian society, the systemic harms inflicted on the poor through economic exploitation, inadequate housing, limited health care, and political disenfranchisement, claimed far more lives than any individual killer could. During the period of the Ripper murders, thousands of East Enders died from preventable diseases, workplace accidents, malnutrition, and exposure. These deaths, while individually noted in parish records and occasionally in newspaper statistics, never generated the public outrage or official response that the sensational murders did. The life expectancy in Whitechapel averaged between 25 and 30 years, compared to 50 or more in wealthy areas of London. Infant mortality approached 50% in the poorest streets. These figures represented not acts of God, but the predictable results of specific policies and economic arrangements that consistently prioritized property rights and profit over human well-being. Housing conditions in the East End directly contributed to this mortality. Overcrowding was endemic, with entire families often sharing a single room. Ventilation was poor, increasing the spread of airborne diseases like tuberculosis. Water supply was inadequate and often contaminated. Sanitation facilities were shared by multiple households and frequently broken or overflowing. These conditions weren't natural or inevitable. They resulted from landlords maximizing profit by subdividing properties and minimizing maintenance, enabled by building codes that were either inadequate or poorly enforced. Employment practices similarly contributed to ill health and premature death. Working hours routinely stretched to 14 or 16 hours daily, 6 days a week. Workplace safety was minimal, with injuries and fatalities common in factories, construction sites, and docks. Many industries exposed workers to toxic substances without protection or compensation for resulting illnesses. Child labor remained widespread despite reforms, with children as young as 8 or 9 working in conditions that stunted their growth and development. These practices reflected an economic system that treated workers as expendable inputs rather than as human beings with inherent rights and dignity. Food adulteration and contamination constituted another form of structural violence. Unscrupulous vendors routinely added harmful substances to food to increase profits. Chalk or alum to bread, water to milk, sometimes with formaldehyde to prevent spoilage, sawdust to sausages, brick dust to cocoa powder. These practices were well known but inadequately regulated, with food safety laws either insufficient or poorly enforced. The resulting nutritional deficiencies and toxin exposure contributed to the general poor health of East End residents. Access to health care was severely limited for the poor. While medical knowledge was advancing rapidly in the late Victorian period, its benefits were unevenly distributed. The wealthy could consult private physicians and access the latest treatments. The poor relied on charity hospitals, workhouse infirmaries, or no care at all. Preventative medicine was virtually non-existent for the working class, with illness typically addressed only when it became disabling, often too late for effective intervention. Education followed similar class lines. The Education Act of 1870 had established board schools, but attendance wasn't compulsory until 1880, and even then, enforcement was spotty. Working-class children often left school as soon as legally permitted, or earlier if they could evade authorities, to contribute to family income. The result was limited literacy and numeracy, restricting economic opportunities and perpetuating cycles of poverty. This educational inequality wasn't accidental, but by design. A system intended to produce enough basic literacy for industrial work without encouraging the kind of critical thinking that might challenge the existing social order. Political disenfranchisement completed this picture of structural violence. Despite reform acts that had gradually expanded the franchise, most working-class men in the East End still couldn't vote due to strict residence requirements that effectively excluded those who moved frequently due to economic necessity. Women couldn't vote at all, regardless of class. Without political representation, East Enders had limited ability to advocate for policies that would address their needs or to hold officials accountable for neglect of their district. These forms of structural violence operated synergistically, creating conditions in which premature death and chronic suffering were normalized as the natural lot of the poor, rather than recognized as preventable injustices requiring systemic change. Individual charity might alleviate specific hardships temporarily, but the underlying structures remained intact, generating new victims as quickly as older ones could be helped. The Ripper murders drew brief attention to these conditions, but that attention typically focused on their most sensational aspects rather than their fundamental causes. Journalists might describe the squalor of a murder scene in lurid detail, without questioning why such housing conditions were legal in the wealthiest city in the world. Reformers might advocate for increased police patrols without addressing the economic desperation that drove women to risk their lives on the streets at night. In this context, Jack's violence can be understood not as an anomaly, but as an extreme manifestation of the violence already endemic to East End life. More personal and dramatic, certainly, but arising from and enabled by the same social conditions that allowed thousands of anonymous deaths from poverty, exploitation, and neglect. His crimes shocked precisely because they made visible, in spectacular fashion, the expendability of certain lives in Victorian society, an expendability that was otherwise accepted as the natural order of things. Everyday resilience and resistance. When the cameras pan away, when the tourists finish their gruesome tour and return to their comfortable hotels, when the books close on yet another theory about the killer's identity, what remains is the story of a place and its people, their daily struggles, their small triumphs, their ordinary lives made extraordinary by their determination to continue despite everything. The fog that shrouded Jack's crimes also obscured thousands of quiet acts of kindness and courage. Neighbors sharing meager meals, mothers sacrificing for children, workers organizing for better conditions, immigrants creating community in a hostile environment. These stories rarely make headlines or inspire walking tours, but they represent the true heart of Whitechapel, then and now. Community solidarity manifested in countless small ways that collectively made survival possible in conditions that might otherwise have been unbearable. Neighbors watched each other's children, enabling parents to work. They cared for the ill when hospital beds were unavailable or unaffordable. They contributed pennies to funeral funds for those who would otherwise receive paupers' burials. They passed along information about job opportunities, housing vacancies, charity distributions, and potential dangers. The thousands of friendly societies, mutual aid associations, and burial clubs that flourished in working-class neighborhoods provided structured support networks, offering members financial assistance during illness or unemployment and ensuring dignified funerals, a matter of great importance in a culture where a pauper's burial represented the ultimate humiliation. These organizations, entirely self-organized and self-funded by working people, demonstrated remarkable administrative capacity and social solidarity in communities often stereotyped as chaotic and atomized. Religious institutions played complex roles in East End communities. While established churches sometimes seemed more concerned with moral reform than material assistance, they also provided practical support through soup kitchens, clothing distributions, and educational programs. Salvation Army shelters, despite their strict rules and evangelical emphasis, offered crucial emergency housing. Synagogues served as community centers for Jewish residents, organizing mutual aid and preserving cultural traditions in the face of assimilation pressures and anti-Semitism. Political organizing represented another form of community resilience and resistance. The late 1880s saw increasing labor activism in East London, from the Match Girls' strike at Bryant and May to the Great Dock Strike of 1889, which mobilized thousands of previously unorganized workers. Women participated actively in these movements, challenging stereotypes about female political passivity. Political clubs and reading rooms provided spaces for education and debate, where workers could develop analysis of their conditions and strategies for change. Cultural life persisted even amid material deprivation. Music halls offered affordable entertainment where working-class performers and audiences created distinctively urban art forms that spoke to their experiences. Street performers, musicians, acrobats, puppeteers, transformed public spaces into temporary theaters. Pubs served as community living rooms where stories, songs, and local news circulated. Even the poorest neighborhoods maintained holidays and celebrations, preserving moments of joy and communal pleasure in difficult circumstances. Children's play adapted to urban conditions, transforming streets, vacant lots, and building sites into improvised playgrounds. Games passed down through generations evolved to fit available spaces and materials. Even in the most deprived areas, children found ways to create fun and develop skills through imaginative play that required little or no equipment. A testament to human creativity and resilience even among the youngest residents of the East End. Material culture, though modest by middle-class standards, reflected working-class aesthetic values and priorities. Even in single-room dwellings, residents often maintained parlor space with prized possessions displayed, perhaps a religious picture, family photographs, decorative plates, or artificial flowers. These arrangements reflected not imitation of middle-class tastes, but distinctive working-class attitudes toward beauty, sentiment, and domestic pride maintained against considerable odds. Economic strategies embodied both practicality and creativity. The economy of makeshifts, practiced by East End families, involved complex calculations about when to use credit, when to pawn possessions, which bills could be delayed, and how to stretch limited resources through careful shopping, food preservation, mending, and repurposing. Women typically manage these household economies, developing expertise comparable to that of financial managers, but rarely recognized as such by the wider society. The informal economy filled gaps left by conventional employment, creating systems parallel to but outside official markets. Street selling, homework, repairs, scavenging, small-scale manufacturing, and various services, from child-minding to letter writing for the illiterate, provided income streams that, while often precarious, offered flexibility and autonomy missing from factory or domestic service jobs. These economic activities required ingenuity, social intelligence, and adaptability, skills that belied stereotypes of the poor as passive or incompetent. Even those engaged in activities considered immoral or criminal by mainstream society, prostitutes, thieves, fences, gamblers, created communities with their own codes, support networks, and survival strategies. These arrangements shouldn't be romanticized, as they often involved exploitation and violence, but they represented adaptations to economic realities that offered few legitimate options for survival. Through all these forms of resilience and resistance, East Enders maintained dignity and humanity in circumstances designed to strip both away. They created meaning and connection where the economic system encouraged isolation and despair. They sustained hope for their children's futures even when their own prospects seemed bleak. They found ways to celebrate life's joys even amid its harshest challenges. Lives beyond the shadow. So as you walk these streets in Jack's skin, remember that you're surrounded by people whose stories are just as compelling as his. less sensational perhaps, but more profound in their humanity. The woman selling flowers on the corner, trying to earn enough for a night's lodging. The factory worker returning home after 14 hours at a loom, feet aching but head held high. The child running errands for pennies, somehow maintaining the capacity for joy despite everything the world has already taken. That flower seller has memories of a countryside childhood before her family was displaced by agricultural mechanization. She knows the names and meanings of every bloom in her humble basket. She has regular customers who depend on her small luxuries to brighten tenement rooms. She has dreams for her daughter, currently in service in a Kensington house, to learn millinery and establish a more stable business. The factory worker bears the marks of her labor on her body, fingers pricked countless times by needles, eyes strained from focusing on fine details in poor light, lungs irritated by textile dust. But she also carries pride in her skill, satisfaction in contributing to her family's survival, and solidarity with the women alongside whom she works. She participates in discussions about forming a women's trade union, having seen the successes of the match girls. She sings while she works, old country ballads and new music hall tunes mingling in a soundtrack that makes the hours pass more quickly. The child has never known any life but Whitechapel, yet has constructed an entire mental geography far beyond its boundaries, from stories, illustrations in penny papers, and glimpses of the wider city on errands to more prosperous neighborhoods. He has expertise in navigating the urban landscape, knowing which shortcuts are safe, which shopkeepers might offer a broken biscuit to a hungry child, which policemen are kind, and which are quick with their truncheons. He attends school intermittently, treasuring the moments when a teacher recognizes his quick mind and encourages his curiosity. These were the real protagonists of Victorian Whitechapel. Not Jack, not the police who hunted him, not the journalists who wrote about him, just ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship with whatever resources they could muster. Material, emotional, spiritual. Their London was damp walls and persistent coughs, cheap tea stretched to last another day, mended clothes and shared beds, hard work and simple pleasures. It was helping a neighbor despite having nothing to spare. It was finding moments of beauty amid ugliness, dignity amid degradation, hope amid despair. The elderly couple who run a small chandler's shop, extending credit to families they know are struggling, remembering which children have birthdays coming up so they can set aside a small sweet as a gift. The midwife who attends births regardless of a mother's ability to pay, bringing not just medical skill but emotional support to women facing one of life's most vulnerable moments. The factory foreman who bends rules to accommodate workers caring for sick relatives, remembering his own family's struggles when he was a child. The teenage girl who minds younger children so their parents can work, teaching them games and stories, protecting them from older bullies, ensuring they have whatever food is available before she eats. The dock worker who organizes reading sessions during meal breaks, sharing literacy with colleagues who never had formal education. The pub landlady who allows women under pressure to leave abusive situations to sleep temporarily in a back room until they can find safer accommodation. These small kindnesses and everyday heroisms occurred countless times daily throughout the East End, creating webs of support and connection that made survival possible in conditions that might otherwise have been unbearable. They rarely left historical records, being too ordinary and expected to merit documentation, but they were the foundation upon which community life was built and maintained. A world apart, a world connected. This is the world that surrounds you as you move through it in Jack's body, a world that continues to exist and evolve regardless of his actions or your temporary presence in his consciousness. It's a world worth seeing beyond the narrow focus of murder and mystery that has defined it for too long. Whitechapel in 1888 was simultaneously a world apart, isolated by poverty, stigma, and cultural difference from more prosperous London, and inextricably connected to the wider city, nation, and empire. Its residents made the clothes worn by the wealthy, processed the food they ate, transported the goods they purchased, cleaned their homes, and cared for their children. Its economic hardships resulted directly from policies decided in parliament and boardrooms. Its overcrowding stemmed from housing speculation and unregulated development. Its health crises reflected inadequate public health infrastructure and medical inequality. This interconnection extended globally through the British Empire and industrial capitalism. The textiles processed in East End sweatshops included cotton grown by formerly enslaved people in the American South, and silk produced in India under colonial rule. The ships loaded and unloaded by dockers carried goods extracted from colonies through systems of forced labor and exploitation. The sugar refined in East London factories came from Caribbean plantations where working conditions remained brutal long after formal slavery ended. The fortunes that built London's Grand West End neighborhoods and fueled its financial district were frequently created through colonial violence, resource extraction, and exploitative labor practices around the world. The poverty of Whitechapel and the wealth of Mayfair weren't separate phenomena, but two sides of the same economic system, one that concentrated benefits upward while distributing costs downward, both locally and globally. This broader context doesn't diminish the specific horrors of the Ripper murders, but places them within a more comprehensive understanding of violence in Victorian society, one that recognizes the connections between individual acts of brutality and systemic forms of harm. Jack's violence against individual women occurred within a society that enacted violence against women as a class through legal discrimination, economic marginalization, and cultural devaluation. His apparent targeting of prostitutes took place within a system that simultaneously condemned sex work morally, while creating economic conditions that pushed women into it and legal structures that maximized its dangers. When you eventually leave this strange interlude, when you wake up as yourself again, back in your own time, your own skin, perhaps what will stay with you isn't Jack's darkness, but the stubborn light that persisted around him, the resilience of those who lived and loved and lost in the shadow of his legend. The most valuable history isn't found in the actions of exceptional individuals, whether exceptionally powerful like Queen Victoria or exceptionally notorious like Jack the Ripper, but in the collective experiences of ordinary people whose daily decisions and interactions shaped the texture of their times. The true story of Victorian London lies not in royal pronouncements or sensational crimes, but in millions of ordinary moments. A mother saving pennies for a child's education, workers organizing to demand better conditions, neighbors creating community despite material hardship, immigrants preserving cultural traditions while adapting to new circumstances. These quiet histories rarely make headlines or inspire dramatic reconstructions, but they constitute the actual lived experience of the vast majority of people in any era. They reveal how large-scale social forces, industrialization, urbanization, imperial expansion, class formation, were experienced on a human scale, not as abstract processes, but as daily realities that people navigated with the resources available to them, creating meaning and connection even in difficult circumstances. So now you lie there, in your bed, maybe not in Whitechapel anymore, maybe not in 1888, maybe you're back in your room, in your time, surrounded by quiet, by safety, by central heating and snack options, and maybe, just maybe, a tiny part of you is still holding your breath. Because for a moment, you were Jack. You didn't ask for it. You didn't want it, but the fog took you in anyway, and now it's letting you go. You didn't kill anyone. That's not this kind of story. But you were something else for a while. something that watched history from the inside and saw how much of it was built on pain, on poverty, on people pushed too far in the dark. Jack the Ripper didn't come out of nowhere. He came from the streets, from the smoke, from the silence of a city that had too many ghosts and not enough names for them. And if you take anything from this between the yawns and the half-closed eyes, let it be this. You are lucky. You have pillows. You have choices. You have soap that smells like lavender and not melted shoe. You live in a world where murders are investigated with DNA, not mustaches and guesses. You can be anonymous online without being hunted in real life. You can complain about your Wi-Fi or your coffee or your coworker named Brad, and no one sends you to the workhouse for it. You get to be tired because of meetings, not because the roof leaks and the rats got into your bread again. And if your eyes are still just barely open, you can tap a like, or subscribe, or leave a quiet comment like, Jack didn't catch me, but sleep did. And as you drift, just know, you survived a day as Jack the Ripper. You didn't last long, but long enough to be glad it's over. So sleep now, friend. The fog is gone, the lamp is out, and the only shadow left is the one curling softly under your blanket. Good night.